When we discussed the music of the classical period, we talked a lot about how form was what made music popular. This was still true in the Romantic era. The best Romantic pieces were written in the most popular forms, and we're going to talk about those particular forms and the composers that wrote them now. Every time I discuss one of these forms during this lecture, it would be great if you'd be willing to make the extra effort and go back and listen to the examples that you now will better understand by knowing what form they are in and a little bit about the composers. I have chosen to not go into a lot of detail about the composers' lives nor about the listing examples because, again, in this period, the music is so much about what you think of the music as individuals, how you feel about the music, and how you respond to it. It's still very important to know how the elements are used, how the composers wrote the music, and the forms they were writing. But it's also, as I've said, important for you to respond to the music without bias. Another reason that we listened to the music before we talked about it this week. So enjoy going through the lecture and learning about these pieces of music. And whenever you're unsure about exactly what I'm trying to describe, go back and listen to these pieces of music again. You already know that Romantic music is divided into four larger categories: vocal music, piano music, orchestral music, and opera. You know this because those were the four categories that you listened to last week. You also know that there were different composers for each listing example in those categories of music, those genres of music. Vocal music, opera, orchestral music, piano music, this is all music that was developed in the Baroque and in the classical periods. However, we do not talk about sonata form or rondo form or really concerto form or specific movement forms like we do in the Baroque and classical. Instead, there are new forms being developed by this new generation of Romantic composers. Remember that they may have respected and believed in the traditions of the past, but they wanted to expand on those traditions, and they wanted to create new forms as well. One of the most popular new forms was a new type of vocal music. Vocal music at this point had been mostly church music, or it had been performed in concert halls. But there were many amateur pianists and many amateur singers out in the world at this period, and they wanted music that they could sing in their homes. So, composers started to write songs. These songs are the things that began the tradition of the pop song that we listen to today. So imagine, if you can, or remember back to the piece of music called The Elf King, Der Erlkönig, that you listened to by Franz Schubert. It was one of your first listing examples, and this piece of music was the beginning of the modern pop song. It's a great example also of very romantic tendencies, as we'll talk about in just a minute. Franz Schubert was the king of the art song. He wrote over 600 songs in his very, very short life of 31 years. Schubert was one of those great romantic artists that strove to be a great composer and great performer and never broke through. He died penniless and in poverty, and he died sick with neurosyphilis. But Schubert, above all things, loved poetry and loved how words could combine with music. So he used the poetry of these romantic poets that were being born and writing amazing, amazing emotional things. And he combined that with his music and created a new form of music, the art song. In its most simple sense, the art song is a composition for solo voice and piano. In a more detailed sense, the solo voice carries the melody and the piano carries the harmony. However, unlike in the classical or Baroque period, the piano carrying the harmony is not playing a supporting role. The harmony is considered equal to the melody. It is integral to the actual musical story being told. If you think about the Elf King that you listened to, the beginning, in the piano part, you hear a galloping horse in the pedantic rhythms of the piano part. And the voice that comes in, it's representing three different characters: the Elf King, the father, and the child, all telling a story as they gallop home, trying to get home and fight against the supernatural. You hear all sorts of interesting things in the harmony as well as in the melody that create this story that fuses poetry and music. And the Erlking is only one example of an art song. There are art songs about all sorts of different types of poetry. Their favorite topics were yearning, love's lost, beauty of nature, fantastical stories, and the supernatural, as in the Elf King. Composers such as Schubert, who wrote art songs, really wanted to reach out to the soul of every human being. So they attempted to convey mood, atmosphere, stories, and images using the elements of music in new ways. These were the first pieces of music in the Romantic era written using new ideas for tone color and new ways of combining melody and harmony to create exciting new stories and love songs. These songs were written for the home, and they were enjoyed in the home. There were three types of art songs you need to know about. The first, and most widely used, was something called strophic form. A strophe is a verse of poetry. So when you look at a poem and you see 4 lines of text and then you see a space and 4 more lines of text, you see a space and then 4 more lines of text, that poem has 3 strophes, each set of 4 lines divided by a space or punctuation. So in music, they had to create music that could help to represent all the different words in each stanza or strophe of poetry. This is the ancestor of the modern pop song. Most pop music is in verse and chorus form, where they will repeat the same music again and again. Strophic form does this. It repeats the same music over and over again for each stanza of the poem that's being used. So the music will go through and we'll have about 30 seconds of music with a melody and harmony, and all of the words for the first strophe will be said. Then the music will repeat, and it will repeat again until all of the strophes have been sung. There's another type of art song called the through composed form. Through composed is literally composed all the way through, which means that it never repeats itself. This is the form of the Elf King that you listened to by Franz Schubert. If you listen to it again, you'll notice that Schubert does not repeat himself because in this sense, there's no strophe or stanza to the poetry. It's a free form verse, and so he created a free form for the music. The last one you need to know about is a modified strophic form. This was modeled on the old ternary form ABA. So you can see that there's a part that repeats, the A section, but there's also a part that does not repeat, the B section. Because of this, it's considered a modified strophic form. When many of these art songs were put together into a set of songs, they were called a song cycle. These were usually unified because of the story they were telling. For example, you could have 12 songs that would overall tell one story, or by the musical ideas that link the songs together. In other words, a composer could use similar melodic ideas or would repeat harmonies throughout all 12, 15, or 20 of the art songs that were put into one of these cycles. The art song really was the only true popular form of solo vocal music. This was very different from the realm of piano music during the period. There were many composers who were also virtuosic piano players, and so chose to write a lot of music for the piano. Remember that in the classical period, the piano finally had come into its own as a very popular concert instrument, as well as an instrument for the amateur in the home. This was still true in the Romantic era, and the piano had been bettered technically as well, so it had really solidified itself as the #1 instrument in the world of music at the time. It was popular both in the home and on stage. Because it had 2 different venues and because it was such a technically mastered instrument, there were many composers that wrote for it, such as Robert and Clara Schumann, Frédéric Chopin, and Franz Liszt. These were the composers that you listened to during your last week of listening examples, and they are the best and most exquisite composers of piano music during this period. They all wrote in different forms and inspired each other to create new forms. They loved writing music. that was personal to their lives. So each of them really did develop new and different forms because of their individual way of looking at music. Most of the forms they wrote in became very popular because they could transfer not only on the concert stage as a spectacle, an exciting thing to see and hear, but they could be simplified and brought into the home for amateur players to attempt to perform. Let's take a brief moment to look at the composers of piano music. Robert and Clara Schumann were a couple, and Robert was a pianist and composer about 10 years older than Clara. Clara was his teacher's daughter and the prize student of the studio, and Robert fell in love with her when he was 17 and she was 9. They courted each other for a long time and fought bitter battles against her father, who just absolutely did not want her to marry a musician. But in the end, they won out against Clara's father and they were wed. They had 8 children together, and they loved each other loyally and deeply, but their life did not end well. Robert Schumann suffered from schizophrenia and other aspects of insanity, and eventually lost his grip on reality and jumped into the river to kill himself. He was saved, but that break from reality never was repaired, and he was committed to an asylum for the last few years of his life. This great composer ended his life only being able to write the alphabet over and over on a piece of paper. After he died, Clara was forced to tour Europe as a virtuosic pianist and gave up composing. She always had been more of a performer than a composer because women were still fighting against this idea that only men could be composers during this era. She was an innovator and was one of the first respected women composers, but she gave that up when Robert died because she needed to be able to feed her 8 children. So she toured all over the country, playing his music and keeping it popular, as well as playing some of her own music. She loved Robert to the end of her life and lived a long life alone. Their story is the epitome of the romantic love story and how it doesn't end well, and it actually inspired many other composers to write about their lives. Frédéric Chopin was quite a different story. He was half Polish, half French, and he was brought up in Warsaw. He loved Polish music and was very nationalistic, but ended up living most of his life in Paris amongst the great artists of the time. He was very shy and very intimate, so when he developed a friendship, he was very emotionally attached to his friends. He was a great pianist and wrote amazingly beautiful pieces of music, mostly intimate pieces of music. And this music was heard by people such as Franz Liszt and Hector Berlioz, 2 of the other great composers of the era, who had already gained fame at the time, and they invited him into their world. He was given access to the greatest concert halls and into the salons of rich, rich people. He gave lots and lots of intimate salon concerts and loved playing music in this sense. He loved writing music for the home and for the salon as well. But Frédéric Chopin loved life so very much and was so emotionally attached to the people he developed relationships with that when his love affair with a famous novelist of the period, George Sand, ended, he couldn't really handle it very well, developed some sickness, including tuberculosis, and died at quite a young age. Franz Liszt is one of our other composers of piano music we'll talk about. He was an important composer for many, many reasons, and he had a much better life than some of the other ones. He was a virtuosic pianist. At a certain point in his youth, he locked himself away for a few years, disappearing from the concert stage, because he was convinced that only with 8 to 12 hours of practice a day could he become the best pianist ever, which is exactly what he did. When he came out of hiding, he was the epitome of the great showman, and people flocked to his concerts from across Europe. He loved the concert stage and basically was the composer that invented the public solo recital to show off his piano music. This is where we get the idea of a real solo concert. Before this, you had orchestra concerts, but you never had a single artist on stage playing hours of music for people. He toured the continent under the title of the greatest pianist of all time. And he wrote a lot of music for himself because he wanted to not only be a great performer, but a great composer. He was an interesting man, influenced by his Hungarian roots, and that was reflected in his music. He also invented new forms of music. In his piano music, he actually took other people's ideas of form and he would recreate that form. But he invented something called the symphonic poem, which we will actually discuss in the orchestral music from the period. It's an amazing type of music that really shows off the programmatic elements of instrumental music. Eventually Liszt, even though he was flamboyant and a showman, took a court musician because he wanted to be stable in his income, and then actually became a churchman. He became an abbé. But he always, to the end, was promoting his music and conducting his music across the continent. The Schumanns, Frédéric Chopin, and Franz Liszt all wrote amazing works in different varieties, and their best works, of course, are for piano, hence why we're talking about them in this particular part of the lecture. Their music was romantic in sound, emotion, and structure, and was written for a romantic audience, but their music is still very popular today because it reaches out to the human soul and evokes amazing emotions. Chopin and Liszt's music in particular has been used in a lot of films and also sampled by today's pop artists. So now let's talk briefly about each of these people's music. You listened to a piece called Carnival by Robert Schumann. This is a cycle of piano pieces. This is something similar to a song cycle, if you remember that from the art song that we just talked about, but it is not called a song cycle. A song cycle is only for vocal songs. A cycle of piano pieces is for a set of piano pieces. Schumann really appreciated miniature forms, and so throughout his life he created sets of pieces for solo piano, such as Carnival. You listen to two movements, Estrella and Reconnaissance, which is French for reunion. These two movements were examples of pieces that can stand on their own. He did not consider these movements of music, even though he was inspired by the idea of a multi-movement work. So you must think of this music in a more romantic sense. Each of these pieces was a piece unto itself, representing one idea, one character, one emotion, one scene. But he would pair them together or group them together so that they created sets. In this case, with Carnival, he was trying to create a set of pieces that were all free in forms, but they were connected because they represented ideas and people from Schumann's own life. This was his idea of a carnival, of a fun time when you see lots of people you know and are inspired by different moments with those people. Estrella was his first fiancée that he broke it off with, and the reunion movement was about the moment when he would see an old friend he hadn't seen for 30 years and how his heart would jump for joy, and that moment of silence when they would embrace, knowing each other still as friends after 30 years. He also included in this set of 21 pieces for piano, two pieces that represented his multiple personalities that were developing due to his schizophrenia. Eusebius and Florestan were the names of those movements if you want to go and look them up. Schumann never wrote in specific forms for his movements. His forms were free. They were through composed, much like an art song, but they were only for piano, not for piano and voice. Clara Schumann's piano music was quite different. Because of her loyalty and love of Robert, much of her music was inspired by their relationship. When she was touring, she used to write letters to Robert that were full of loving, loyal, supporting sentiment, and sometimes with those letters she included romances or romanzas. A romance is a piece of music written for solo piano that expresses love and joy in life. That's a short, lyrical piece. It represents the emotions related to a loving relationship. She wrote many romances. The one you listen to is one of her most beautiful, the Romance in E-flat minor, Opus 11, number 1. Now that you know more about their love story, go back and listen to it one more time and see whether that makes you think of the story differently, since in the end you know that Clara loses the love of her life, and that she wrote these romances as love letters to him. Chopin's music was much like himself, very shy and intimate. He wrote almost exclusively for solo piano because that's the instrument that he played, and he thought it was the most intimate of instruments. He wrote in many forms that became popular, and he invented forms that became popular, such as the nocturne and the polonaise and the étude. The nocturne is a form that Chopin created in order to create restful, calming music for his audiences. Again, remember, he was shy, and so many times in his life he would be hiding behind a window or in the recesses of the walls at a party, being a wallflower. And so he spent much of his time contemplating the outside world and the beauty of such things as night. He loved the idea of a lullaby, and his idea of the lullaby was the nocturne. The nocturne is simply a night song for piano, meant to evoke the gentle and sleepy qualities of the nighttime world. He created the nocturne by using complex harmonies, including chromatic harmonies. He also created a very fluid, moving sense of harmony and melody because he never settled in one key or another. He simply moved from one key to the next. And he used the piano in a way that created a very restful tone color that was intimate for listening. When you listened to the Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2 by Chopin, did you feel the sense of calm? Were you put at ease by the music? His idea was, of course, to calm you and give you something to listen to at the end of the day that would make your day better and more peaceful so that you could rest well. However, even though he was shy, he also did have moments of joy, and that came out in his music in forms such as the Polonaise. Remember that he was half Polish, and his Polish roots and being raised in Warsaw really allowed him to love the sound of Polish folk music, including the dance forms of Polish folk music. He used those dance forms and transformed them into such forms as the Polonaise for solo piano. A Polonaise is a piece of music that's Polish in origin and has a triple meter, 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. So it dances much like a waltz, but it has the sound of the Polish folk music. You listen to the Polonaise in A-flat major, Opus 53, written later in his life, in a moment when he was really inspired and feeling nationalistic about his music. Because think of this as a national piece of music. He was inspired and used the music of Poland. He was Polish, and so took pride in that, and that nationalistic quality comes out in the very form and name of the piece of music. This is a much more bright and exciting piece of music that would captivate an audience and keep them cheering on for more. It could be used in the home or on the concert stage. The étude was another great form of piano music. This form had been invented before this period, but we haven't talked about it before this period because it had never been used in any way except as how it is defined. An étude is a study piece designed to help a performer master a specific technique on their instrument. An étude can be written for any instrument, but Chopin and then later Franz Liszt both wrote tons of études for the concert hall on piano. They created they used it even as a concert form rather than just simply as a study piece. So they popularized the form. And audiences really loved this form because it showed off the virtuosity of the performer. Chopin was able to create many études that would develop the technique of the player while showing off their virtuosity to an audience. One of their best was the revolutionary étude in C minor, Opus 10, number 12. You also listen to another étude by Franz Liszt. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Franz Liszt was inspired by new forms that other Romantic composers were using and by old forms like the étude. You listen to his Transcendental Étude number 10 in F minor. Liszt's music was more complex than most of the other Romantic musicians because he was a little later in the period. Sometimes it was so hard, he was the only one who could play it. It was transcendental. It was above and beyond what other people could do. And this étude was an example of this. Even today, only the very top, maybe 5 or 10 performers in the world can play this music well because it is so very difficult. But audiences are stunned when they see it played live because it is so exciting and yet so romantic and passionate. So go back and listen to the etudes in particular and see whether you can feel the difference between the two etudes and see whether you can imagine yourself in the concert hall listening to these great performers creating this amazing music.